Hello, everyone. Welcome to the web seminar, How SMBs Can Get Executive Buy-in for Disaster Recovery as a Service, produced by IT Pro Today and sponsored by Carbonite. Please note that this web seminar will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You'll receive an email when the session is available for review. Also, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to type them into the question box on your webcast console. And at this time, I would like to introduce our speakers. James A. Martin is an award-winning technology journalist who has covered cloud software and many other aspects of computing for media outlets such as IT Pro Today, CIO, and PC World. Tom Powers, Director of Program Management at Carbonite, is responsible for product delivery and works closely with engineering and go-to-market teams on new releases and offerings. Prior to joining Carbonite, Tom was Director of Operations for Client Services at Avaya, where he helped ensure successful onboarding and serviceability for customers. He also spent time at IBM working on the M&A team, where he helped integrate several acquisitions. Tom has a passion for delivering innovative products that solve challenging customer issues. Before we go ahead and get started, we have a question for the audience. How many critical systems do you have in your environment with downtime tolerance of less than 1 hour? Less than 10 hours, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, or more than 100? All right, it looks like the majority of our audience has less than 10 hours, with 50 to 100 coming in second. And with that, I will hand it over to Jim and Tom.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so just a quick comment before, this is Tom, I'll hand it over to Jim. That's about, the less than 10 is what we expected for this group, but it's actually a little bit surprising that we got so many that had 50 to 100 critical devices. And so what that tells me is we've got a mix of, kind of mid to smaller typical environments with some larger ones. And so, it's really the critical systems that can't tolerate a ton of downtime that we're talking about when we talk about disaster recovery as a service. And so, yeah, the 50 to 100 is definitely a little surprising, but definitely not surprised by the 67% or so that's less than 10. So, Jim, I'll hand it over to you to kick things off.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I was a little surprised by that 50 to 100 as well. So, but it's good information for us to have. So let me move on to the next slide. And, okay, so we're going to talk about you for a minute. One of the things that I've thought about as I was preparing my slides was a lot of you are probably moving your small to mid-sized business into the cloud, or maybe you've already done it, but I think that that's the trend that everybody's going towards, and so that's part of why what I'm going to be talking about, taking that into account. You're smart. You know the cloud isn't 100% fail-safe. There's an assumption that some people have that if you put stuff in the cloud, because it's not on-premise, that somehow it's magically protected. And while it is true that the cloud can be a pretty safe place to be, particularly in a disaster that affects your physical location, nothing is 100% fail-safe. You know what's at stake if a disaster hits. You know that your data is at stake, your business continuity, business recovery, all of those things are at stake if a disaster hits. But you have limited human and or financial resources to help plan for and recover from a disaster. And the business decision makers at your company, they may not see the value of something like disaster recovery as a service. Again, they may be thinking, okay, we're in the cloud, doesn't that protect us? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And my goal here is to give you some convincing talking points that you can then go back to your business decision makers and give them, so maybe you can help convince them that you need some kind of disaster recovery plan so your company can bounce back quickly from the unexpected. So let's talk about the unexpected. What could possibly go wrong in business today? Well, natural disasters. They were in the news, human-made disasters as well. We're going to talk about both. So natural disasters were really big in the news last year. It was the costliest year on record. $306 billion in U.S. damages alone just last year. We had some major hurricanes, Harvey, Maria, Irma. The California wildfires, I saw that firsthand being in San Francisco. Tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, severe thunderstorms. Right now we got a volcano going off in Hawaii. And just for a little bit of perspective, it's easy to kind of think that these big disasters only happen maybe in like the Gulf Coast states and California. But, you know, last year there were billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters pretty much all around the country. So as far as natural disasters, I want to give you some data points to keep in mind when you talk to the business decision makers about this. 14 of the 20 largest wildfires in California history have happened just in the last 18 years. And by the way, I just read something in the news this morning that big wildfires in California are expected to be the new normal. 21 weather events caused $1 billion in damages during all 10 years of the 1980s. And then if you compare that to last year, in 1 year alone, 16 weather events cost $1 billion in damage. So there's going to be, the trend is more frequent severe natural disasters. We're going to be seeing more of those in the coming years. For example, this hurricane season is expected to be slightly above normal. As we know, last year was way above normal. A little context here for you. The U.S. government's costs because of climate change-related events could increase by $35 billion per year between now and 2050. So that's just kind of the big picture. So if it's costing the government more money to deal with disasters, it could be costing your business money to deal with disasters. And then, so now I want to summarize. I'm going to be giving you some summaries here and there of the top talking points. And so, to summarize, natural disasters are likely to get worse in frequency and severity. Your recovery costs from those disasters are going to climb. But there's good news. Those losses are tax deductible. Okay, now let's talk about the human-made disasters that businesses face today. Ransomware. I'm going to spend some time on ransomware because it's top of mind for a lot of people. It's in the news a lot. The city of Atlanta was basically shut down recently because of it. But there's also a misconception that ransomware is really focused on government and healthcare and large enterprises. But in reality, it's a big threat to small and medium-sized businesses as well. More than half of SMBs experience successful or unsuccessful ransomware attacks. This is according to the Ponemon Institute from 2017. Ransomware, for 1 in 6 affected small and mid-sized businesses, ransomware caused 25 hours of downtime or more. That's a lot of downtime. And some of those reported 100 hours or more of downtime. So ransomware, here's another data point for you. 22% of small and medium-sized businesses that experienced a ransomware attack ceased business operations immediately. That's a pretty scary data point in my mind. This is from a 2017 study, by the way, from Malwarebytes. And then some more data points for you. 75% of SMBs think ransomware protection is a high priority. They know it's a problem, and they know they need to be protected. But only nearly 50% have little to moderate confidence that they can actually stop an attack. And then more data for you. 27% of SMBs with ransomware didn't have any idea how they were infected. 37% reported that the ransomware got into their system from an email attachment that somebody downloaded that shouldn't have downloaded it. 27% came from an email link, like in a phishing email. Somebody inadvertently or unwittingly clicked that link and the ransomware got in. More than 33% of infections spread to multiple devices. Okay, a little bit more about ransomware, again, because it's a big topic. It cost the world $5 billion in losses from data and productivity. This was last year. Now, in 2019, that's going to be $11.5 billion, so more than doubling in terms of lost data and productivity costs. Okay, so ransomware is not the only thing to be concerned about. There are other data security risks that small and mid-sized businesses face. Lax oversight of BYOD is a big problem. Mobile malware is increasing. Poor use and reuse of passwords, phishing emails, and Internet of Things data leaks. This may not be a big problem yet, but the more we start to see smart speakers and devices like that in the business world, the more concerns there may be for data leaks. Now, I also just want to step up a bit and say, at a high level, small businesses are a growing target of cyber attacks. Again, there may be a perception that because you're a small business, why would somebody bother with you? Well, the reason why they may bother with you as far as a cyber attack is you may not have the defensive resources and the recovery resources that a larger enterprise may have. So you may be an easier target. And this chart, it's a few years old, but it shows you how cyber attacks have steadily climbed against small businesses. And here's a kind of a scary data point. 60% of all businesses, not just small businesses, enterprises as well, 60% that lose their data shut down within 6 months. And so let me summarize some talking points here. Ransomware is a threat for small businesses. Ransomware not only costs money, if you pay the ransom, it can cost 25 hours or more of downtime. Data and productivity losses from ransomware are going to keep going up. Ransomware is just one of many potential data threats that small and mid-sized businesses face. And again, 60% of all businesses that lose their data shut down in 6 months. Okay, so now let's move on to what's it cost you to not be prepared for a disaster? Excuse me. There are downtime costs, there are data breach costs, and then there are other costs, and I'll touch on each of these. Downtime costs. 1 hour of downtime equals a loss of about $8,000 for small businesses. This is from a report from 2015, the IT Disaster Recovery Preparedness Council report. So 1 hour of downtime on average can cost a small business $8,000, $74,000 for mid-sized companies. So if we do the math, we see that if you take that 25 hours on average from a ransomware attack and you multiply it by 8,000, it's $200,000. And that's for the small business. And for the mid-sized business, it could be $1.85 million. So we're talking a lot of money here. Data breach costs. Small businesses are most dramatically impacted by data breaches. Now, again, you may think that because you're a small or mid-sized business, you're not on somebody's radar screen. But hackers know that you don't have the resources, typically, in terms of security and other things to protect yourself. The non-reimbursed incident response cost on average per compromised record, like let's say a customer record, is $1.72 per record. That can total about $14,000, and that excludes legal, regulatory, or other fines. So this is the average loss from a data breach for a small business, and this is from the Ponemon Institute. Other costs, loss of customer trust and or reputation. You can't even put a dollar sign on that. I wouldn't even know how to begin to calculate that. Top consequences from cyber attacks. Information loss is the top consequence, 43%. Business disruption, revenue loss, and equipment damages. This is from an Accenture study from last year. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize some top talking points for you. 1 hour of downtime can cost a small business $8,000. Ransomware attack can cause you 25 hours or more of downtime. We do the math, that means $200,000 loss for a small business. So the cloud isn't invulnerable, and I stated it that way because I think a lot of people think it is invulnerable, but that's not the reality. Cloud infrastructures can and have been knocked offline. I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to pick a little bit on Amazon because they are the leader in this market, but in April 2011, some Amazon cloud services crashed and permanently destroyed some of the data. I included a screenshot over here from an email that Amazon Web Services sent out, and it says something here that would chill any spine. It says, "We are very sorry, but ultimately our efforts to manually recover your volume were unsuccessful. The hardware failed in such a way that we could not forensically restore the data." Not what you want to see. Now, again, that was 7 years ago. It's been a while, but in more recent times, in March 2017, there was a human error that caused an outage of AWS that lasted several hours. It affected Zillow, GitHub, Slack, and some other companies. In March 2018, there was a power loss that caused service disruptions around the world from Amazon Web Services. Now, and some customers experienced elevated latency and packet loss. So, by no means is Amazon the only company that's had this happen. Microsoft, there was, in last fall, nearly 7 hours Northern European customers were without the service. And I love this headline over here. It's because someone accidentally set off the fire extinguishers. Google has had some too. I didn't find a whole lot about them, but again, they're not invulnerable. So again, just to summarize, cloud services can and do go offline or crash. They can be offline for hours, and in worst case scenarios, customers have lost data. Okay, so now what do we do about this? I'm going to talk about co-location data centers as one option. Co-location companies provide data center infrastructure to their clients. The customer rents the floor space, the rack space, and sometimes, not always, the physical hardware that they use within the co-location center as a backup, disaster recovery backup for their own data center. The costs are shared among customers leasing space in the facility. And all that's great, but you sometimes have to deal with multi-year leases, and they can be expensive. And you may not be able to add more space in the facility. The facility may be completely booked up. It's like putting your storage in a storage facility, your furniture, but then you have to take your living room and take it to a different storage facility because your regular storage facility is full. You don't want to do that. And it can require high CapEx, capital expenditures up front, if in the case you have to invest in some of the hardware. A secondary data center of your own is another option that some companies, particularly larger companies, can do. Some have a secondary data center for specifically for disaster recovery. You get to control all of this. You decide where the center is located. You decide the equipment that you put in. It's all up to you. But the downsides to it are the CapEx is high. You have to build this data center. The OpEx can be high too because you've got to cool it. You've got to send power to it. You've got to do all those things. You've got to have staff there. It can be expensive to run it as well as build it. So, disaster recovery service, that's sort of like a third option here for you to consider. And some things to know about disaster recovery as a service. Generally speaking, you're going to get a fully hosted backup recovery and failover in the cloud. You can immediately return applications to production because the data doesn't need to be restored over the internet. It can be a good option for SMBs, especially ones that don't really have the human resources or the technical resources that's involved in provisioning, configuring, testing your disaster recovery plan, and then more importantly, scrambling to get back online if a disaster actually hits. The replication can happen in real time, so there's very little chance of data loss. You can recover physical and virtual servers. You can return to the original location or move your servers somewhere else. There's no CapEx involved. You don't need to invest any money up front and you don't have to maintain any kind of off-site disaster recovery environment like a secondary data center. You can get discounts for prepaying, but one thing you should be aware of is additional fees might be required. There may be premium level services to get a little extra hand-holding to walk you through a disaster and recover from it when it happens, setting up virtual private networks, failover charges, things like that to be aware of. Okay, so let's talk about how you're going to talk to your business decision makers. So I'm going to summarize all the main points that I think are probably the most important of everything I've said so far. Natural disasters likely to get worse in frequency and severity in the next, well, just in the foreseeable future. Small businesses are a growing target of cyber attacks, such as ransomware. Ransomware alone can cause your business to go down for 25 hours or more. An hour of downtime can cost your small business $8,000, or if you have 25 hours, $200,000. 60% of all businesses that lose their data shut down within 6 months. And moving to the cloud is great. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's going to continue to do it. It's the way to go. But be aware, cloud infrastructures have had widespread outages, and some of those outages have caused data losses. And then as far as disaster recovery as a service itself, it can be a pretty compelling, affordable option for small and mid-sized businesses because there's no CapEx involved. Your OpEx is going to be fairly low because you're not having to spend money to run a data center or a co-location. You typically pay only for what you use. You have reduced risk because you've got people who are disaster recovery experts from your DRaaS service. They're the experts. They're going to help you out if and when the disaster hits and you need that help. There's little chance of data loss, and you can immediately return your applications to production. All right, so that's my main points that I wanted to get across, so I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks so much, Jim. Some really great data points, and I'm going to add a few more data points. But just as Ashley mentioned, my name is Tom Powers. I'm Director of Program Management here at Carbonite. I'm also accompanied by Sean Sellers, who's our Senior Product Manager for our Carbonite Recover product. And we're going to talk a little bit about Carbonite's philosophy on data protection, which you'll notice fits nicely in with a lot of the things Jim has said. And then we'll kind of tie off with our product Carbonite Recover, which is our disaster recovery as a service offering that offers continuous data protection to our cloud, which supports immediate failover during an outage or for one or your entire set of systems. And so today's business challenges are very clear. There's explosive growth in data. That data has become your company's most valuable business asset. And there's a need to have a comprehensive data protection strategy. A lot of companies have kind of a piecemeal approach over the last 10, 20 years to their data protection. They might have chosen a vendor 15 years ago and then another one 3 years later, another one 5 years later, and that results in a patchwork environment with multiple vendors, multiple invoices, not a single strategy, but multiple vendors, and a bill that isn't necessarily optimized across all of those solutions. And downtime is unavoidable. And so Jim gave plenty of good examples. There's natural disasters. I'll give you one more example. And so there was a telecommunications company in the UK recently that was impacted by just normal severe flooding, some downpours, and this was in the UK. And these downpours caused flooding at one of their data centers, which caused outages for a severe number of users on Christmas Day. So there were a number of users who could not call their loved ones on Christmas Day because of this flooding. And so that's one example that impacts all sorts of citizens of the United Kingdom. It impacts the brand name of this large telecommunications company, all because they weren't prepared to deal with the flood. A couple other great examples of just normal accidents or normal unplanned downtime. The Toronto Stock Exchange last month went down for a full Friday, and this was due to a hardware failure. And so they actually couldn't trade for a full Friday afternoon. And this impacted Canada's main stock and derivatives businesses. And so you can imagine the financial impact on an economy like Canada's, and that seriously impacted a number of people who were looking to trade, and also even the Montreal Stock Exchange, which had to pick up the slack. I'm not sure if everyone realized this, but on tax day, the IRS had a hardware failure, and they didn't meet their own deadline because they had an outage, right? And so they had to delay tax day by a day. And so as strong a force as the IRS is, they weren't even prepared for a normal hardware failure. And so, just these things happen, and not to mention normal accidents, right? And so put aside the amazing stats that Jim has given throughout his slides, and just put yourself in the shoes of an IT leader if you're not an IT leader yourself. Outages damage the goodwill of your organization. They put undue pressure on just the lives of the normal IT employees. Suddenly they've got to have an extra bag of Doritos and pull an all-nighter with a Mountain Dew trying to fix an outage that would nenever have happened. And maybe they have a family, and maybe that impacts them. And so there's a trickle-down effect that you actually can't measure, right? And so these are the things that are always going to be unavoidable. Ransomware, Jim has talked about plenty. We know about that. And even planned downtime, right? Not an accident, not something that catches us by surprise. That even is tougher to manage if you don't have the right tools and the right strategy in place. And so, as I mentioned, the costs are significant, and a lot of times they are immeasurable. I'll throw a couple of more cost stats at you, as Jim has given you plenty, but I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but the city of Atlanta recently had a ransomware attack, and the ransom was $51,000, and they were the type that did not want to negotiate with the bad guys, and so they refused to pay the ransom, and they ended up spending more than $2.5 million in expenditures to recover from that ransomware. And so it went from $50,000 to $2.5 million. And a very similar example, there was a hospital in Indiana that had a ransomware attack for $50,000, and they paid the $50,000. So they recovered. They were lucky enough to recover. But these things happen all the time, and depending on the size of the business, depending on the criticality of the systems impacted, it could really have a negative impact on your business. And so at Carbonite, we feel that the ideal data protection strategy and solution has three parts. It's a solution that is consistent and one comprehensive solution, or as comprehensive as possible across all of your systems. So these systems could be physical, they could be virtual, they could be critical, they could be less critical, they could be in the cloud, they could be legacy, they could be on IBM i. We feel it's highly valuable to have one solution and strategy across all of your systems. We also feel that the deployment and management of those systems should be as low cost as possible. So you shouldn't need to hire a whole staff to manage the data protection console or the product. It should be easy to use. And then we also truly believe in having exceptional support and assistance. And so if you're going to come to us for data protection, you need to be able to call somebody because you've come to us because you feel you need help in deploying your strategy, and we want to be there to help every step of the way. And so we feel we cover all of these scenarios in a number of ways. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the ways we cover it and how many customers we cover, the type of systems we cover, and then, as mentioned, we'll end with Carbonite Recover. And so we have a lot of experience across our product lines, across our customer bases in protecting data. So we've protected more than 25,000 customers. We've performed over 100,000 data migrations. We've got a very high customer satisfaction rate with support, hundreds of petabytes of data, and more than 1,000 partners and more than 20 years experience across our teams and products. And again, going to that comprehensive data protection strategy, we have a product or solution or answer or strategy to all types of systems, all types of recovery time objectives, and all types of recovery point objectives. And so I'm going to show you a couple of different views of types of systems, but you know in your own environment whether the value to your business, whether a system is high, the value is high, whether it's critical, whether you need it up all the time, or whether you'd lose a lot of money if it was down an hour, or whether it's some file server that nobody accesses much and it could probably go down a couple days. The strategy for dealing with each of these scenarios or protection strategies is different. And so we offer a suite of products that allow you to basically choose the mix of a solution that best suits your products or your systems. And so we go from home and consumer all the way up through the MSP realm, and we have backup solutions that can back up your server for long-term retention. We can back up physical servers. We can back up virtual servers, and all the way up to Carbonite Recover, which covers the most critical of systems, the most stringent of recovery times. And so we believe with our suite of solutions, you can talk strategy with us, and we can bring you to a solution that covers all of your needs, both from a budget perspective and a solution perspective. And just one more way to think about things is really your environment is made up of 3 categories of systems. Your critical systems, those that you can't have down more than seconds or minutes, and you can't afford to lose any of that data. It's too critical. You'll be in trouble. There'll be a bullwhip effect. 6 months from now, you may be out of business. Then there's the second-tier systems that can be down, maybe minutes, maybe up to hours, but not really much longer than that. And then you've got your third-tier systems, which you could probably live with them being down a day or even a couple of days. And the distribution obviously varies per environment, but we feel about roughly 20% of systems in an environment are critical. Half of them are second tier, and that can kind of border between needing to be down for minutes versus needing to be with an allowance of being down for hours, and then your third-tier systems. That being said, we feel that you should have a backup strategy across all of these systems, and there should be long-term retention with all of these systems so that if you need to do discovery of data from 2 years ago, you have those copies. And if you need to recover from some point in time, let's say you had a ransomware attack and you traced back 3 weeks to when that ransomware started, you can recover to 4 weeks ago, right? And so we feel that across any type of system, you need to have a long-term retention and backup strategy. And then the critical systems, and this goes to why we talked about how many critical systems you have in your environment, why that was an important poll question for us, we really feel is what you should be thinking about when it comes to disaster recovery as a service and Carbonite Recover. And so just another view, from hours to seconds, we have a solution that can cover your threshold and the criticality of your systems. And so we're going to move to a poll question now before we end here our section about Carbonite Recover. If you could fill this out, do you currently have a secondary data center or co-location facility? And so I'll give you a second to answer yes or no to that. And that will kind of help dictate. That's a very important question. That's oftentimes the first question that we ask when we're talking to somebody who may potentially be interested in disaster recovery as a service. And the reason for that is if you don't have a secondary location that you can have failover to or you can move data to, then disaster recovery as a service is something you want to strongly consider for your critical systems. And that's because more than likely, if you don't have that secondary data center, your board of directors or your big budget decision makers may be concerned with running an environment that is highly secure, and they may not want to be responsible for securing that environment, right? And so it's important that you partner with somebody who does this for a living, who are experts in this, to make sure that the environment's secure, it's locked down, and that you can recover very quickly. And if you don't have a secondary data center, then you more than likely don't have those resources, but we are here to help. So let's take a look at the poll results. And so it looks like actually it's a high percentage of responders say they do have a secondary data center or co-location facility. 78.3% do, 21.7% do not. And so with that, let's talk about Carbonite Recover. So Carbonite Recover is Carbonite's answer to disaster recovery as a service. And so basically in a nutshell, it allows for continuous replication from your systems, physical or virtual, to our cloud. And when I say our cloud, you are basically renting space, for lack of a better term, in our data center, and it's secured with our experts as if you were having a co-location facility or secondary data center. So rather than building up a whole facility with even all the costs that come with it, you're just carving out a piece of our cloud within your network to be able to fail over to. And so this is byte-level protection with recovery times in minutes and recovery points in seconds. And a cool part of this is the orchestration factor. And so you could basically orchestrate any number of systems or applications that are dependent on each other so that when you fail over, you can design the startup order and scripting so that the failover is as automatic as possible. So as you know, there's IT environments are complex. Systems rely on each other, and you don't want to have a staff to manage that failover to make sure it works properly. You want to be able to configure and set it up in a way that you can test as often as you want to make sure it works and tweak the configuration, but not need a whole staff to fail over, because we know that the failover is going to happen at the most inopportune time where you don't necessarily have a staff or you don't have the budget to pay for a staff to manage that. And so the idea here is you don't need a staff, you don't need a whole secondary data center. We are here and you're paying for a subscription with us for this service to cover all of those unknowns for you. And it's secure and scalable, so we're talking AES 256 encryption, both in flight and at rest, and testing for complete confidence. And so this is probably the most important aspect of this. So we have a team of experts that will work with you upon first setup to make sure that your failover works and that you can actually simulate a disaster and that your systems work. And then thereafter, you can test as often as you like, and quarterly, you could do. We have people that do it even more than that. We have people that do it annually, biannually. But the key is you can simulate and test with this system, and that's something that is very hard to coordinate when you're owning every step of it. And finally, we offer expansive platform support. So Windows and Linux are the primary systems that we often see in there, but we do also offer the service for AIX, Solaris, and IBM I, and those legacy systems. So that's another value prop of ours, is that you can have a service, you can work with our experts for both modern systems and legacy systems. And so I've kind of already explained how it works. Here's a visual. And so your primary system will continuously replicate to our cloud. And again, think of it as your piece or your rented out piece of our cloud, secure. And when there's a disaster strikes, then you would hit the failover button, and now your systems and DNS would fail over, and you'd be operating out of our cloud for some period of time. And as Jim mentioned about disaster recovery as a service, there would be a modest price, $1 per gig of RAM per day to live in our cloud. So you wouldn't live there forever, but as soon as you're ready, you'd fail back, and your data would sync back to the new system, and you'd continue protecting it the same way you were before. And so that is Carbonite Recover. And if that is something that interests you, reach out to our sales team. And so you can send an email to dataprotectionsales@carbonite.com, or you could call 877-542-8637, or you can just go to carbonite.com and explore. All right, and with that, I believe I'm handing it back to Ashley for the Q&A section.
All right, great. Thank you, Tom. If anyone does have any questions for Jim or Tom, please type them into the question box on your screen. I see we already have a few, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. First question, is this compatible with ESXi and all of our VMware hosts?
Yeah, hi, this is Sean. I can take that one if you want, Tom. Yes, we are compatible with ESX and VMware in general, so we have specific integration that helps with discovery and protects those VMs running in a VMware environment. We're also compatible with Hyper-V. In fact, we support physical, virtual, or cloud-based environments.
All right, great. Thank you, Sean. Next question. How often should I be doing failover testing with a disaster recovery as a service provider?
This is Tom. I'll jump in, and then Sean, you can comment, and then Jim, you can give your industry expertise. So as I mentioned, we definitely, as part of our disaster recovery as a service engagements, recommend that you test fully upon deployment as part of your deployment. And then we recommend testing at least quarterly as our base recommendations, and at the absolute minimum, doing a full test every year.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that recommendation, and we've tried to make it as easy as possible with our solution so that you can actually test in a non-disruptive manner. You can test leaving your production servers and users online, so you can pretty much do that anytime during the day, and so you can do it more frequently. And as Tom mentioned, yeah, it's unlimited. It's part of the offering, so you can test as often as you like.
Yeah, and I would only add, I agree with that. I would say that, and it depends on the size of the company. If you're a really small company, you may not have the resources necessary to test every quarter, but I think you should, at a minimum, do it twice a year. And one way to think about it is if you're operating your business out of a building with other offices, normally there's going to be a fire drill every so often. You could kind of time it with a fire drill, like that week that you have a fire drill. Okay, let's check our disaster recovery as a service and make sure everything's working properly and we can recover from it. Time it to some kind of event that typically happens, and that way you'll be on track to do it.
All right, great. Next question. After a failover and running for some time in the Carbonite cloud, how do I get the data back to my original server?
Yeah, this is Sean. I'll take that one. So after you're running in the Carbonite cloud, it's kind of a two-step process to recover or restore. And basically those are the two key steps. So once you've made your repair to either the original server that failed, whether it was a disk failure and you've fixed that, or if it's a new server that you've spun up to replace the original, you would do a restore, and that sends the data, synchronizes it back to that newly provisioned server or repaired server. And you are doing that synchronization while the users are online, the applications are online and running in our cloud. So there's no disruption while you're doing that sync back to ground. And then when it's convenient, you can take a brief outage to pivot the users and the applications back to that repaired or replaced server. A lot of times that'll be done after hours.
All right, great. Thank you. Next question. Can you explain the typical onboarding process for a new disaster recovery as a service customer? Will you help us establish a DR plan and facilitate testing?
This is Tom. I can jump in on that, and then Sean can comment, and Jim, you could give your anecdotal expertise. And so as part of our offering, we have two flavors of our offering. We have a basic offering, which will help you onboard, and you can run your own tests. And we'll certainly be there as support and to help you run your own tests. But we also have a premium offering where we will white glove the whole experience for you all the way through a run book and a plan, going down to planned disasters or even hurricane tracking, where we give you a call and help make sure your plan's ready for something that might be coming up. And so that's our white glove premium service where we will hand you a run book and help you with your plan for those critical protected servers. And so in both cases, we're there as part of the experience. Our premium experience is a little bit more involved where we actually hand you a run book.
Yeah, and it all starts with a questionnaire. So we want to understand your applications, your networking, all those things that are tied to your environment. And then we'll reach out to you, and once we provision your resources in our cloud, so basically your virtual data center, we'll work with you to provide connectivity through a VPN tunnel. And the next step would be that what we call our failover test, acceptance test, and that's kind of the sign off for between us and the customer to confirm that the solution's working and it'll be ready to use when you need it.
Yeah, and I would just add that in my opinion, disaster recovery as a service is not your entire disaster recovery plan. It's a critical component of it, but I feel like there are other things, and these guys can help you with that, but there are other things to figure out in a disaster recovery plan. For example, what are the lines of responsibility and what are the lines of communication? You know, work out like who's going to do what in case some disaster hits. How are you going to communicate with that person? Does that person have the phone numbers for everybody else that's involved in your disaster recovery team? And I think you should have kind of again, depending on the size of your company, have some team that is focused on this as part of their job to make sure that your company can bounce back as quickly as possible. So there's a lot of disaster recovery plan documents out on the internet you can find from reputable sources. I would recommend that you also look at that and take the bigger picture into account.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. Next question. How do you protect from network failure between your data center and a potential customer's data center?
This is Sean. I can take that one. So, and I'll go ahead and tackle the next one too, because they're kind of related. It's about network efficiency or bandwidth utilization. So, as far as network failures, or when we have congestion or high latency, our technology has a queuing mechanism that we'll fall back to, and so we try really hard to avoid resynchronization if we can. So we queue to memory, and then we'll fall back to a disk queue eventually. And when we do finally exhaust that disk queue, and both of those queues, by the way, are tunable. You can configure the size, so you can manage that to some degree. But when we do fall back and exhaust both of those queues, we will resynchronize. So, and that kind of segues into the next one. As far as efficiency goes, we are very efficient at resynchronizing. We do a difference compare in a couple different ways. We can check to see what files are open and handle those in special ways. We have also bandwidth throttling and compression to help with that as well.
All right, great. Thank you. Next question. Are my security compliance policies adhered to in event of a disaster?
So I'll jump in on this. So as Sean mentioned, there's a detailed survey that we work in when we engage with Carbonite Recover on a customer that's purchased the solution. And part of that survey is figuring out what your policies are, and making sure that as part of the solution and part of the testing that we adhere to them. And so I'm not sure if there's specific policies that are involved there, but yeah, as part of the engagement, we definitely want to make sure we comply with any of your internal requirements or needs.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. It looks like we are out of questions. Thank you to Jim and Tom for your presentations, and thank you to Sean Sellers for joining us for the Q&A. As always, thank you to Carbonite for sponsoring today's event. Just a reminder, the seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so feel free to come back and review. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.